This is Lawrence Lang, and I'm still at the house of Lorraine Daniels in Essex, but now we're joined by Michael Heyland, who was the Director of Productions with the D'Oyly Carte from 1969 until 1978. Michael, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, and a pleasure to be with you.
One of the things I'm wanting to achieve from these interviews is to find out what life was like in a touring theatrical company such as the D'Oyly Carte, which was on the road for 48 weeks a year. However, before we come to that, what tempted you to join the D'Oyly Carte?
Well, I went to the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, initially as a horn player, with singing as a second study. After about a year, I realised that I was not going to be the top horn player I thought I would be. So I went to the principal and said, actually, I'd rather like to join the drama section. He said, well, we have a slight problem. He said, we're rather short of horn players. So I'll do a deal with you. You can certainly join the drama section on condition that you stay in all our orchestras. So I said, well, that sounds wonderful. So I did both courses, really, for 3 years and left an actor. So then I went into rep and, of course, was promptly out of work. It was one of those things where it was very depressing to be out of work because you felt no one wanted you. However, work did pick up, and I spent 6 years in repertory. Wow. I was in pantomime with Cyril Fletcher. I was in a musical at the Royal Court Theatre in Sloane Square, which was rather unusual, a Brecht Kurt Weill musical called Happy End. And then I was in A Christmas Carol at the Theatre Royal Stratford East. Right. So I had a variety, and I did 2 or 3 television plays, radio play, I did a couple of films, small parts, nothing to write home about. And then I thought, well, where can I combine all my experiences? And at that time, an advert came up in Gloucestershire looking for a dynamic fundraiser. So I went for the interview, did a 3-month course, and went down there and started organising events which were all supposed to make a profit. Luckily, we ended up with a £40,000 profit at the end of the year. And at that time, I wrote to the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, thinking, well, my music experience and my theatre experience, surely this would be an ideal marriage. So I had a couple of interviews, and later on that year, I joined the company in Manchester as assistant director.
Oh, right. So quite a varied career to get you to that position.
Yes, it was just lucky how things just worked together.
So, as I said, the company toured for 48 weeks a year. What challenges did you face personally from living from a suitcase? And secondly, possibly more importantly, what issues did the company face by being in a different theatre almost every week?
Well, our tours were usually fortnightly. Sometimes a week's date in a smaller city like Hull, for instance, or where maybe we didn't quite have the following that we might have done. Like, for instance, we dropped Coventry because we were in Birmingham a month later. So Birmingham was always a very hot spot for us, which was good. Touring in a suitcase, my first year was quite lonely because I'd been living in digs before because of being in rep, because I was in quite a few different repertory companies. And of course, the second year around probably was easier because I knew some of the digs I'd been to before. I found places where I could stay nearby with friends. And later on, I bought a caravan, right. One of the few in the company who had caravans. And we used to find sites together. And invariably, it was obviously not quite next door to the city involved, but it was a drive, but usually parked in a nice, peaceful place.
And you had some sort of home comforts with you.
I had all my home comforts. I started learning cooking, yes, and I was lucky I had a winter sports caravan, so in winter it was perfect, and warmer than a probably average house, I would say.
And I suppose you said that to start with it was quite lonely. I suppose in your position within the company, you were relatively isolated, I would imagine, because at least the performers, they would have some sort of immediate bond because they were all on stage together, whereas you were a little bit isolated from those, being the director of productions.
Yes, that's very true. I was told to keep separate. But of course, I was very lucky, in fact, that Bert Newby, whose job I was taking over as he became business manager, he was actually he was like an unofficial godfather to me. Any problems I had, I would talk to him. He'd been in the company his whole life, so he was a highly experienced touring manager. He'd been started in the chorus, he'd become an understudy, had played small parts, he was principal tenor understudy, and then he became stage director, then director of productions for a number of years. So there was nothing in the company he didn't know anything about. So he was a wonderful advisor for me. I got on very well with the music staff, Jimmy Walker, Peter Murray, then later on, of course, Royston Nash, David Mackey, and a host of others, like a young chap called David, who came into repetition and went off to a ballet company in Switzerland. David Cookson, that was his name. And of course, then there was two others whose names will come back in a minute. I can't remember at the moment.
Although over the years the D'Oyly Carte have made a few live radio broadcasts of the operas, very few productions have been televised. There was mainly the Patience in the 1960s, but you were the production director for a televised screening of HMS Pinafore that was recorded for ATV in 1973. Potentially a very different venture. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was lucky in a way because having worked in theatre, I was involved in a few TV plays, and I knew how to go through the production moves, dialogue, and particular with any particular asides, and when the laughs occurred, including dance moves. So John Sickle, who was the TV director, would know which camera to use. This took probably 2 days of my running through the entire opera with him. So I would advise him on a particular camera angle, which he knew far better than I did, because of, say, John Reed, Sir Joseph Porter doing an aside to someone, or when it became to Dick Deadeye doing his Silent B, what was that? He'd would be able to pick up and do intimate shots on those sort of scenes. So that was a great help to me in the past. And John Sickle I found delightful to work with. And of course, in the meantime, the studio crew were being advised by Peter Riley, our then stage director, to make an exact copy of the set. And as we approached the final preparations, I remember talking to John Sickle, and I said, please, I don't want any canned laughter. It sounds so false. And he pulled a long face, because that's exactly what he intended. But I said, look, let's have an invited audience, make it look as though it's a theatre production. And so he looked at that and he hummed and hawed. And he said, what about the orchestra? I said, well, let's just make an orchestra rail and imagine that the orchestra's there. And Royston Nash actually had to kneel to conduct an orchestra underneath the curtain rail, as it were. And it all seemed to work very well. Right.
I was going to ask about the laughter. You know, I was wondering whether there was a live audience there. So
yes, it was an invited audience. I'm surprised you weren't there.
Well, no. Well, it came as a complete surprise to me actually when I saw it in the TV Times, and there was talk at one stage, I think, that they were planning to do something similar every Christmas, to have an opera sort of televised, but unfortunately the Pinafore was the only one that ever was recorded.
Yes, well, I following that up, actually, I did go back to the head office and I said, look, why don't we video record performances even when we're on tour, particularly in the bigger cities like Manchester, where they had TV companies. Why don't we record every opera? But the union rates were so high, the MU, the equity, and of course then royalties on top of that. It was such a headache that it was dropped.
Right. And you were talking about Royston conducting. I do remember at the very beginning of the video, as the curtain opens, you see the back of Royston conducting, and I started thinking, he's not going to be there for the whole time, is he? But luckily he faded away while the action then happened.
Yes, the cameras went in straight to the set.
Yes.
And the other unusual thing about the lighting was that we kept on, because the stage lighting is quite different. You have a lot of different colours and gels. It was very white lighting,
right?
And apparently that was for the cameras. So all the lighting was white.
Right. Did the company feel that the venture was successful? Would they have liked to have done it again, if finances had allowed, or was it felt possibly let's stick with?
No, the company would have loved to have done it. But the trouble was, we were in Liverpool at the time,
right?
So the company were coming down by night train to be on hand at the studio at some unearthly early morning hour,
yes.
And then back to a local hotel. Then, of course, they had to shoot back to Liverpool for the Monday performance.
Yes.
So it was done over the weekend.
Right. Well, thank you very much for sharing that information with us. During your time with the D'Oyly Carte, you were responsible for 3 new productions, 2 being for shows that most people would never have seen performed by the D'Oyly Carte during their lifetime, being The Sorcerer and Utopia Limited. And then you were also responsible for a reimagining of Iolanthe. The Sorcerer was of course added to the repertoire, but the Utopia was originally only intended for 1 performance as part of the Centenary fortnight. I was fortunate enough to be both at the Utopia and the Grand Duke. I mentioned that the Utopia was originally planned just for the 1 performance during the Centenary fortnight, but fortunately another 4 performances were included when you did a short London season at the Festival Hall.
Yes, we had quite a few problems there because
right.
We were using projection, and of course the projection screens were curved, so what happened, to sound technical, we actually got polarization. If you are one side of the audience, say stage right or audience right, stage left, audience right, you saw one picture. If you moved across to audience left, that picture vanished.
Oh.
And it was the same with Mikado. I mean, at the opening of Act 2, for The Sun Whose Rays, you saw this lovely lily, and if you moved round to the other side of the audience, the lily vanished. So there were problems with the projection, but of course people coming on stage of course had to walk down the choir stalls, so it wasn't like a normal theatre, although the Festival Ballet used to be there regularly, English National Ballet then it later became. So whilst the ballet companies were quite used to it, it was new to us.
But at least you did still manage to keep the famous camel on stage, which
I love the camel.
Which was an important aspect of it.
Yes. Well, of course, being originally staged in a Western Isle, my idea was actually to have it more attractive costumes as opposed to grass skirts. So I turned it into the Middle Eastern Isle, and the costumes were much more decorative, much more colourful, and of course we tried to have this sort of Mediterranean atmosphere, so as the curtain went up you heard cricket singing in the background and all those little touches we could do. And of course the camel was a wonderful idea. Of course he didn't really move.
No.
But it became a lovely stage prop.
It did indeed, yes.
Yeah.
So with both of those new operas, the Sorcerer and Utopia, you wouldn't have necessarily had any guidance to follow as to the sorts of characters that you were dealing with. How did you go about deciding what the character was of each character?
Well, having been trained as an actor, of course, the first thing you do is when you read your script is I used to read everyone's part. If I got a play, say in repertory, I would read everyone's part just to imagine how they felt through their eyes. And so I picked up these pictures, like Wellington Wells. Okay, Cimmeriac, so he came from London, so I thought he was more like a music hall Cockney.
Right.
And of course it wasn't Cimmeriac. So I had to learn that one because people in the city knew all about that. So Wellington Wells was one of the easiest ones to do. Young Alexis, of course, being a typical stiff upper lip guards officer, we had to keep that image because obviously clearly that's what he was meant to be. But of course he had this fervent ardour to have all the village fall in love like he did. So he was a bit of a chinless wonder, really. When it came to Dr. D'Oyly, that was the part that I found really colourful because I sort of imagined a bishop say, like character, but with a mix of Richard Wattis, you know, the famous film actor. I'm trying to remember the other actor I was thinking who was always playing bishops. Miles Malleson, that was it. So I said to Ken Sanford, if you could actually imagine a mix between Miles Malleson and Richard Wattis, and very airy-fairy, he's in love with life, he's always loves everyone. And then, of course, hit upon the idea of him cycling across the stage on a sit-up-and-beg bicycle.
That was a wonderful innovation the first time I saw it, and you know, after the opening chorus, Ken cycles across the stage. Yes.
Well, of course, the element of surprise is so important, and of course, again, with Sorcerer, we had the villagers, and I thought, well, having been brought up near two villages, village life is very rich with its characters. So I wanted the chorus to actually have their own individuality as far as group. So they were in small groups. You got the smart villagers, you got the household staff, you got the good old country yokels, like who worked on the farm, and then the poor village simpleton and an old couple. So all this you'd find at the local village fete.
Yes.
And of course it was like a fete because they were holding this reception to celebrate the engagement of Aline and Alexis. And so that all came together. And of course the difficult part, Sir Marmaduke, it's a very straight part, but he just had to be straight. He had to be the perfect squire. And Lady Songazir, of course, Lady Blue Blood, had to be the perfect lady, and of course Aline had to be the perfect young heroine. So the other characters did actually help to enrich the whole scene. And reading the music, listening to the music, I kept hearing this village band at the beginning. I thought, we've got to have a village band. So out of the chorus we had a bass drum, I was going to have a sackbut and a cornet. And Osbert Lancaster, who has a wicked sense of humour, he looked at me, he was taking everything down when I described what I was imagining for that production.
So Osbert was the
designer,
yes.
Costume and set designer, and he'd done quite a few Glyndebourne operas, I know, before that. He said, well, what about a serpent? And I had to think a minute, a serpent. So this curly-whirly object that was sort of a mix between a bassoon in sound and something that you resonated down a mouthpiece. So I said, perfect, because it actually didn't take up too much space. So the village band was formed with the cornet, the drum, and the serpent. And of course, there was, if you listen to the overture, there is a little band playing there. So every time the first two main entrances, in came the village band. And they, of course, added different colour, the red tunics they were wearing, and of course the instruments, and always a few props always help, like the bicycle always helps. Then it got to the magic spells. I discussed this with Peter Riley and a friend of his called Robin Barnes, who made them, and of course we had explosions going on. Now they had to be safe. I always remember watching my first pantomime at the Palladium, and this puff of smoke went up on stage, and there appeared whoever it was in shining armour. I think it was Anton Dolan playing a knight in shining armour. And so we had obviously various tricks going on. We had the teapot, which blew up smoke, his hat, his wizard's hat, Wellington Wells' wizard's hat, that blew up smoke. So we had lots of fun and excitement with the props. And of course then the magical table that was lined with fishing line across the stage. So when Wellington Wells pointed at the table, it slid across the stage invisibly to the audience. We had a lot of fun doing that.
Yeah. Now, I really enjoyed The Sorcerer. I saw it in Brighton, just shortly after it had opened, and a lovely show. And talking about Dr. D'Oyly, Ken Sanford coming on with the bicycle, I always remember how he stopped and picked a flower and put it in his buttonhole. It's lovely little touches like that.
And Virginia Mason, of course, was wonderful for the movement. All the dances were rehearsed with me first, and if I couldn't do them, we didn't do the dance.
Right.
So, and things like the Wellington Wells dance he did, and the chorus dances, they were all very imaginative, done by Virginia. She was excellent.
I'm sure that John Reed managed to pick up those dance steps quite quickly, being a very nimble individual.
He was a very good mover, very good mover.
Right, that really sort of covers some of the characters within the Sorcerer, but Utopia, that was last produced by the D'Oyly Carte, back in the early 1900s. So you had really sort of nothing to go by with that one. How did you start to think about that for the characters?
Well, like Sorcerer, Dame Bridget gave me carte blanche.
Right.
She said, I want you just to do exactly what you like. So the first thing I thought, which I mentioned before, was I moved it into the Middle East.
Yep.
Because the oil crisis was happening at the time,
right, yes.
and a lot of people were thinking about the Arab world, etc. So I put it in the Middle East. Yeah, going back to the characterizations, of course, Scapio was the plotter of the schemes to upset everything that the king did. But so Fantis, I made to be, I said to describe to John Eldon, can you imagine as being actually rather thick? And he just agrees with everything that Scapio does, but he always sort of comes in at the end, having not quite understood what was going on. And for instance, there was a gesture, a Muslim gesture, where you touch your forehead, God be in your head, God be in your heart, and then you shake hands. So that's 3 moves. And John Eldon would come in with 1 move later. So
right.
he actually shook hands in midair when everyone else had walked away.
A bit like Corporal Jones in Dad Army.
Yes, absolutely, yep. Yeah. And John Eldon was a talented actor, and in fact he was very, very... They were both excellent in their roles. Then, of course, the Public Exploder, and of course he was having explosions everywhere. So that was he just followed what Scapio and Fantis did, really. The Captain Fitzbattleaxe, of course, again was the rather chinless, gallant guardsman, which made a perfect foil for the lead.
Princess Zara.
Princess Zara, absolutely, and of course her sisters. Princess Zara, of course, had to be the perfect heroine. She'd been to university and had come back. Everyone, of course, had come back anglicised. And so explaining the plot was quite laborious in a way. And then when we got to all the different characters appearing, it was like some 7 men form an association. That was quite a lengthy song, and Michael Rayner did that adequately and very good diction, but he had to actually explain the structure of a limited company, what may that be, or all that business. So it's a long time ago, so going back to it now is quite difficult, whereas Sorcerer, being my first production, always stayed in my head.
No, and well, as you say, with Utopia, it is a complicated story anyway, isn't it?
It's a complicated story. And
not
also,
quite as complicated as the Grand Duke, but
no,
it's complicated enough.
Yes, complicated story, but also because of all the different characters in it.
So thank you for putting it back into the repertoire, even if it was only for 5 performances.
I loved it.
Yes.
Short though it was.
Yes. With the Centenary fortnight, you were performing different shows on every days, and sometimes the matinee was different to the evening show. And one performance, the Mikado, was actually broadcast live on Radio 3. All of these factors must have created significant stress for everyone concerned. Did you have any major problems that you had to overcome during that time?
Everything had to be very carefully planned, but being towards the end of the tour, most shows were in the repertoire, except the ones you mentioned, and of course Princess Ida. So of course extra rehearsals were running up to 4 music and drama rehearsals a day, 3 days a week. The wardrobe department were totally overworked, and the stage crew were working day and night, taking sets out and bringing new sets in, and some of them actually went to sleep on the stage in breaks because they couldn't go home.
No.
It was literally 24 hours a day they were working. They did an amazing job. And of course Peter was lighting all the shows. So, mind you, he'd done them all before, except of course the new ones. And it was just, it worked. I mean, I actually was given a room at the Savoy opposite the theatre so that I could be there virtually all the time. But the stage crew were just amazing.
Like I remember Harold Wilson coming on stage at the end and talking about how wonderful the D'Oyly Carte Company was, little knowing really that in 7 or 8 years after that, unfortunately, everything would come to an end.
Lack of sponsorship. That was the problem. Just lack of sponsorship. if we'd had a good team of sponsorship hunters working for us, it would have been a different story, I'm sure.
And it must have been so expensive, touring.
Touring had got very expensive. Then they were talking about touring allowances coming in, because we all lived off our own salaries. We can't walk salaries, fees really. We all lived off those when we toured. So if you had 2 homes, it was a bit of a struggle.
Yes, I can imagine. Yeah. One of the highlights of the London season was always the mysterious last night. The audience would not know what was going to happen. The programme just had 3 question marks on it. Maybe you could guess some of the items that were going to be played if you heard the orchestra tuning up. So, Michael, how did you come up with all the ideas for different things to do? And did you get any resistance from the management as to what you wanted to do?
Oh, yes. I was told by head office that the surprises were usually scenes out of different operas. However, the cast were hoping usually for something else. So the 8 years that I directed were ones that only 3 that really stuck in my head out of the 8 years that I did The Last Night for. So I thought I've got to have something interesting for the Mikado to make a grand entrance. So there was a very popular young elephant at the time called Tanya, who was featuring on TV. So I rang up the owners and said, could we possibly borrow Tanya for the evening at Sadler's Wells Theatre? So stage manager there advised that the elephant would be too heavy for the stage. So I had to think. He offered me Elan, and I said no, that would scare me and the cast.
Possibly a bit too dangerous.
Yes. Well, that's what we imagined. So I had the idea of bringing a horse on. So John Eldon hadn't ridden it, but I'd been brought up with horses, so I was happy leading the horse on with John Eldon. And of course the horse stood there while he sang his opening aria. And of course the horse got a bit nervous and droppings ensued, and someone was already prepared with a dustpan and brush.
And that was Michael Rayner, if I remember rightly, as part Japanese costume and part Sergeant of Police.
Yes, that was it. Well remembered, yes. And the prop I found, the song Tip Willow, always actually I found a very moving, beautiful song. So I thought it was so sensitive, I thought it probably needed a little bit of sending up. So I asked John Reid if he minded singing that song to a stuffed vulture. He gave me a wicked grin and said, that sounds really fun. And so Peter Riley duly hired a stuffed vulture. So when it came to the song, Peter Riley just walked on with this stuffed vulture, and John Reid sang the whole song to him.
Oh, wonderful.
And I thought that was, a wicked little touch. Then the other idea was Impatience. Again, I wanted to have a milk float coming on stage, but of course everyone said they're so heavy, the stage wouldn't be able to take it. So I ended up asking Patience to bring on a case of milk bottles. Because she was the village milkmaid. So it was just quite natural prop.
Of course.
So she dropped the bottles outside Bunthorne's home, and that caused amusement. But I think probably the best one I had was an Iolanthe. When they mention about Iolanthe living at the bottom of that stream, and then she sort of magically walks out of it. And that previous summer I'd been in France with my flippers, snorkel and harpoon gun. So I thought, well, it just naturally that she should come up with a mask and snorkel and flippers and a harpoon gun, because she's got to live. And so at the moment that she walked on stage, of course, the whole house absolutely collapsed. And endless to say, I did get rather a stiff letter from head office saying this wasn't really in the right vein for the opera. However, it stuck in my name, and I remember Peggy Ann Jones being interviewed by the Manchester Gilpin Sullivan Society, and she actually brought that scene up, although she couldn't remember how it came about. Penultimate year was in the curtain call. We were all bowed to the audience, and John Reid just turned around and gave me a custard pie in my face, which was a bit of a shock, but I took it on the chin, as it were. And so my last year, I thought, right, I'm going to do it to you. So he wasn't expecting it. So someone in the chorus, very kindly, he said, I don't want to do this because, I'll get into trouble. And I said, well, I'm the director. I'm asking you to do it. And so he kindly brought it up, this custard pie, on behind my back. So when we bowed, and I just whapped it into John's face, and he took it very well, but we both, I'm sure, had letters from head office saying it was not in very good taste.
No. We've talked about the Sorcerer and Utopia Limited. We didn't really touch on your reworking of Iolanthe, and just very briefly, we were chatting a little bit about it over lunch before we started the recording. You said there that head office didn't really object to much that you came up with for the last nights, but I understand from what you were saying there was a little bit of a pushback with one particular element of your plans for Iolanthe.
Yes, I was not given carte blanche, I found out, for my third production. Mind you, I had left the company by then, and I came back as a freelance. And of course, my original choice was hopefully that Peter Rice would be the set designer, but he hadn't been well, and so they decided to find a newer face on the scene, which was Bruno Santini, who had some lovely ideas. It was really done in silver. It was quite impressionist. He had a doily gauze at the front, so once the lights went through and it was backlit, you saw all the fairies in their amazing silver costumes and their lovely wings and their wands. My idea was to make the fairies quite militant, particularly when in Act 1 finale, when I got Virginia Mason to do a majorette's march.
Right.
And so they were really telling the peers what they were going to do, and to that much the peers' horror, my opening scene, of course, was going to be St James's Park, where it was supposed to open, was originally a deer hunting park under the reign of Henry VIII. So gradually it had become a little bit more open to the public. So my idea was that all the House of Lords, members of the House of Lords, were of course rich landowners. So they would turn up in hunting gear, fishing gear, shooting gear. No, they're not doing that. They're going to enter in their full robes. So my opening idea was quashed. Sadly for me, because it didn't suddenly appear to be a new production. Everything really else was, except that just spoilt it.
I suppose it's such a well-known sequence, though, that
yes,
the complaints that you may have got by
I'm
getting
sure
rid of it,
the fans would have complained,
objected.
Yes,
but yes, well, it's interesting to know though that you did have plans for it.
Yes, and then of course my other idea that was quashed was in Act 2 we'd changed. Obviously, there was a different picture of the House of Lords, but of course the sentry box was there, stage left instead of stage right as it was before, and I had invented what I thought rather cleverly was this flying in machine, which actually was a conversion of a sack lifter. Being on a farm, we had a sack lift, a huge flywheel, you wound a handle and this platform went up. Well, my idea was that it would be wedge shaped, so it would be behind the sentry box on a plate, so with the Fairy Queen flying in with her huge voluminous ballroom gown type, what do you call it, crinoline frock, you would never see the plate she was standing on. Wow. So she would magically slide down this V-shaped ramp. But I was told it was A, too expensive to make, and B, too lumpy to take on tour. So that was squashed. However, I there again, of course, the company kept my production book. So a lot of my memories have faded with Iolanthe, I'm afraid. But probably because I didn't have carte blanche.
No. And I suppose you do have to take into account, as you mentioned, the fact that the company is going to be on tour. So
exactly,
whilst you can do some things in large theatres, once you get to the smaller ones where there's very limited wing space, etc., it does create more challenges, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Did you ever have any of those moments where you thought, as Captain Corcoran might have said, "Dammy, that shouldn't have happened"?
Yes. Luckily, only two really stick in my mind. The first was we were on tour. A new season had started, and so we were only a fortnight into this new tour, and we had arrived at De Montfort Hall in Leicester.
Right.
and it was going to be a Mikado that night. Now, of course, there were a lot of changes of cast between the last season and the new season, so there were a lot of understudies who still weren't completely au fait with their new parts. Whilst they knew the music, they didn't know the moves. No. So on this occasion, on the Monday, so opening at De Montfort, Leicester, got a phone call from Ken Sanford, who was very rarely off, to saying, I can't sing. So we had no Pooh-Bah, and we were new on tour. The present understudy couldn't do it because he didn't know it. And of course, Bert Newby came up with lots of different ideas of previous understudies, etc. And I thought, well, I'm going for the last understudy, who was Arthur Jackson, who'd been understudy for Pooh-Bah for 2 or 3 years, and had recently just joined the Welsh National Opera. Right. So I rang the Welsh National Opera in Cardiff and explained my problem. I said, can we possibly borrow Arthur Jackson? They said, it just so happens he's just turned up for a rehearsal. So I said, can we have him, please? And he said, of course. Oh. We'll pop him in a taxi. And so by this time, it was sort of after lunch. And so I knew he was coming up from Cardiff to Leicester. So my heart was absolutely thumping away, thinking, I hope there's going to be no hiccup on traffic and he's going to get there. So immediately the wardrobe department were undoing a costume because the new Pooh-Bah was quite slim and Arthur Jackson was quite portly, had a large frame. So they were undoing his the new understudy's costume, and the wig department, of course, preparing a new wig. And, of course, the whole cast knew that Arthur was coming back, hopefully. And the overture started, and still no Arthur Jackson.
Oh, no.
So the overture finished, and the applause happened, and suddenly the taxi arrived. Arthur was pulled out of the taxi, pushed into the wardrobe department, stitching the costume onto him, and someone else making him up. And he went on, bang on cue, word perfect.
Yes, because you've only got about 10 minutes, really, haven't you?
What a relief!
Between the end of the overture and Pooh-Bah's entry. Wow, amazing!
The other occasion, again, the tenor, Colin Wright, we were in Pirates Penzance, I forget where we were, and he did the opening scene fine. And he came off stage and said, my voice is gone. My voice, I can't sing. So we had to rush to get Derek Booth, who was in the chorus but understudied Frederick, and push him into a new uniform, and he went on bang on time for Stop Ladies Pray. And of course the audience were clearly shocked with a new Frederick.
Yes.
With no announcement.
Well, thank you for talking through some of the things that you did whilst you were with the D'Oyly Carte. But what would you say was your happiest moment during those number of years that you were with them?
It was different. It was my first tour of America. Now, the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company used, in the earlier days, go to America probably once every 2 years, but there'd been a lapse since I joined that we hadn't been to America at all. So this is, say, 6-7 years later, we had this fabulous 6-month tour, coast to coast, America and Canada. And I managed to include my wife with me and my 1-year-old son. Oh. So he toured with us, and, well, with both of us. And, of course, because we had much better income from the dollar exchange, is that we didn't stay in digs, we stayed in hotels, which was luxury, really. So we had a wonderful 6-month tour of America, and it was a particular thrill to have a show on Broadway,
yes,
or shows on Broadway, and of course Hollywood. None of it was filmed, unfortunately.
No.
There was we were well sponsored through the Hanson Trust and British Airways. Harold Wilson, I think, even flew over. And the sponsors organised soirees at a lot of where there was a high commission. We had soirees, and of course the American Embassy in Washington. We gave special soirees too. I remember giving a soiree to the Harvard Club, and we became special members.
Oh wow!
At the Harvard Club, so I've still got my Harvard tie. Oh. Yeah, so I loved it, and ending up in Los Angeles was thrilling, absolutely thrilling. On one peculiar night, the whole audience stood on their seats.
Oh.
And I was really rather shocked. I wondered what on earth was happening. So I asked someone in the front row of the stalls, and they said there's a skunk walking through.
Oh.
Being an open-air theatre, of course,
Yes.
you could probably get some coyotes coming.
Well, I do remember when I was talking to Jane Metcalfe, she was talking about, I think it was at the Hollywood Bowl, and performing Iolanthe, and she said that some raccoons actually came up onto the stage during one of the scenes.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you've talked through a number of items that you were involved with the company, but you left in 1978. What did you get up to after you left the D'Oyly Carte?
I was extremely lucky in one link from the D'Oyly Carte, because we had given a special charity performance in the Lancaster Room at the Savoy Hotel, sponsored by the Hanson Trust, and one of his directors, Colonel Osborne, had invited the Cancer Research Campaign to be the beneficiaries of that performance. And of course it was bristling with Harold Wilson and other ministers, etc. A lot of VIPs were there that night. And as a result of that, the Cancer Research Campaign had been looking for an events consultant. And so through Kenneth Osborne, he introduced me to them, and I was lucky enough to have a contract. It started off by being 1.5 days a week, advising them on events, what to do, not to do. And then that same year, I got the job as a festival director for Lambeth Festival, and one of my 3 smarter shows were at the Old Vic, and there were hits of Gilbert and Sullivan,
right,
with choruses and ex-principals. John Fright was one of them. April Cantelow, who hadn't been in the D'Oyly Carte, was another. Timothy West played Gilbert.
Right.
So I was quite honoured to have these sort of well-known people join us. And as a result of that, I had there's London Mozart players playing for 2 nights. And the general manager, Michael de Grey, then said to me afterwards, he said, actually, I'm leaving my post as the general manager of the Royal Choral Society. Would you like to apply for the role? But of course, things had to be advertised publicly. Yep. So I applied and was very lucky to get the job as general manager of the Royal Choral Society. So I started off by working with Cancer Research Campaign and managing the Royal Choral Society. So I did something like 7 concerts that I produced a year with all the top London orchestras, mostly then LSO, later the RPO, British Concert Orchestra, Covent Garden Orchestra. So we were doing concerts at the Albert Hall and Festival Hall. And I was very lucky enough to inherit an office of the Royal Choral Society in the Albert Hall. Ah. So I had an office in the Albert Hall for 8 wonderful years, and I could just watch everything in rehearsal, which was fascinating. It could be boxing, it could be Miss World, it could be ice skating, which was rather disastrous spectacular at the beginning because the ice hadn't quite frozen. Oh. And then I picked up, I started working with LBC Radio as a sponsor, and then Capital Radio. And one of our concerts at the Albert Hall was the Capital Radio Music Festival. Right. And with LBC, I organised the London to Paris Treasure Hunt. And again, for other charities, I worked with the Mental Health Foundation. So I had the most exciting 20 years of my life.
Well, what a full and varied life that you have led, really, for the whole of your career. So
I've been very lucky.
Yes, it certainly sounds like it. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for spending time with me this afternoon to talk about particularly your time with the D'Oyly Carte, but also those interesting things before and after. And I do feel that it's so important to actually have these recordings made because, unfortunately, otherwise these memories will get lost. So it's important to keep them for future generations. So thank you so much for coming over and spending the time with me this afternoon. Thank you, Michael.
It's a pleasure.